Okay, so our next speaker is Aparna. Previously worked as the she is the vice president and general manager for augmented reality and Google Lens. She also serves on the board of Capital One. Aparna previously worked as a senior director and technical assistant to the CEO of Google, helping drive company-wide product efforts. She also led Google Now, a proactive digital assistant effort, and worked on many areas in Google Search and YouTube over the years. With over 20 years of experience in the tech industry as a computer scientist and a product leader, she is excited about the potential of AI algorithm to build products that improve everyday life. So please join me in welcoming Aparna, moderator Benjamin Moritz, director at Evolve Network.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's really a great conference, and we hope that you're going to really have a great time. We have a great speaker now, and we also have great speakers later, so we're really happy to have you here. So, Aparna, wonderful having you here. It's your first time at BSCF.
Yes.
I hope you're excited. So maybe as a way of introduction, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your experience, and how you got to do what you do now at Google?
Great. The stretching break is over. Hi, everyone. Am I the one between, I don't know, before drinks or dinner or something? Okay.
No, we still have a great panel after this. So.
That's great. My name is Aparna. So excited to be here. I run augmented reality and computer vision-based products at Google. I've been there for nearly a decade, doing a whole bunch of different things, but really all of them, the common spike being deeply algorithmic products, developing products that are at scale, impacting users. Worked on Google Search, that's where I cut my teeth. Worked on YouTube, worked on Google Assistant, and I also serve on the board of Capital One, which interestingly is more similar than different. We can talk more about that. Yep. But excited to be here.
Wonderful. So you actually talked about Capital One. How is that different from what you do most of the time at Google?
I have to confess, so I've been on the board for 1.5 years, and at first I thought these two worlds are so different. It's, one is Valley, tech, the other is financial services, East Coast, but I'm more struck by how similar they are in a couple respects. One is that, this was a little known fact that Capital One invented like the first A/B testing in the real world, meaning they would send direct mail with a certain copy to certain subset of customers, and then another copy to other folks. Think of it as A/B testing, except not on the websites, but real life. So it's a very tech-driven problem-solving ethos. The second big similarity that I'm seeing, which is something only that I'm internalizing now, is at the end of the day, like if you think about a transaction or if you think about a balance in an account, it's all information, right? It's fundamentally information and data. So a lot of the techniques that I guess you all are familiar to is with AI and ML really translate very well across these industries. So it's been fascinating to see, like you can solve risk fraud, or you can solve money laundering with better techniques in AI.
Great. So would love to talk a little bit about product and also AR and vision-based products. So just a show of hands in the audience, who works in product? Okay, quite a lot of people. And who is also involved in everything vision-related, AR, VR? All right, so we have some folks too. So would love to talk about product. What is, in your career, are some bad recommendations that you've heard in terms of managing products?
I thought I knew what you were going to say. That's a sharp left. Tons of bad advice, I would say. And then some good advice too, and some subset of it that I actually followed. I think a couple of bad ideas I would call out. One is this what I think of as the tidy, clean version of reality, meaning, hey, like first step, you think about this stage of the problem, you look at the user problem, then you tidily come up with a product, and then you ship it, and then everything is hunky-dory. The reality is not that linear. So a lot of you who are either building products or wanting to build products, the reality is a lot more kind of circular. There's multiple loops that happen. So one of the things I've the anti-advice is like, I would say, assume that you'll have multiple iterations. You will necessarily take multiple shots at solving the problem. The other one I would say is, bad advice-wise, oh, you just need to think about the strategy. Like, think 50,000 feet, think about the problem in abstract, and then the answer someone else will execute. Terrible advice, right? Fire people who say that. Because I think one of the things you'll realize as you build more products is that you need the micro and macro. You need to be able to operate in multiple zoom levels. What do I mean by that? So for example, at first, if you don't have the strategy or you don't think about the problem right, it's like finding yourself in the wrong continent. So it doesn't matter if you got the neighborhood right or the specific detail right. You're shit out of luck, right? So you do need the macro. You need to pick a big, meaty problem. You need to pick a big market, etc. But on the other hand, there's, I think, a bad, set of habits that build when you are roughly in the neighborhood. You're right. You're pick the right problem, but you don't have the details. As they say, the God and devil is in the details. So often I find, when I worked on search or YouTube, the execution is the strategy. Like, the ideas are a dime a dozen, a lot of million details going to execution, and you need to know the micro as well. Yeah. So there are many PMs or product builders who dissociate themselves from the details, and they can't make good decisions anymore.
No, that's definitely great advice. And when building products, what role do you see data playing, and how do you leverage data in building products day to day?
So with the preface that I've worked on pretty much only data-driven products between search and assistant and YouTube, etc. I would say I think there's a subtle difference between being data-driven versus data-informed. What I mean by that is at the earliest stage of the product, you should look for qualitative insights as much as data. I've been in meetings or situations where A/B testing is often a poor substitute for not having a spine or not having an opinionated view. So you do want to have those qualitative insights, especially when earlier stage when you don't have enough data, right? So you can't of course you can have 2 data points and draw any curve, so don't do that. I would say, think about, put data in its right place. But having said that, once you do have a usage of the product, think about the importance of the right metrics. The metrics need to inform how you think about the product. So to give you an example, one of the products we're working on is what it was called Google Now. It was a precursor to Google Assistant. And the metric was basically, it was a product that would notify you when, say, you were late for work or your flight was delayed, etc. There was no interaction between the user and the notification. So if you traditionally went by click-through rate or other metrics that involve interaction, you'd say, oh, that sucked. You didn't interact with the product, so we must have screwed up. But if you look at qualitative data, it was tremendously useful for users. So I think the metrics have to be really thought about based on the product, I would say.
Yeah, so more qualitative data early on and then quantitative data later. So that's... And so maybe we can talk a little bit about vision-based products and AR. What are some of the exciting things that you're working on?
Fundamentally, one way to think about my mission and my team's mission is, how do you rethink people interacting with the world camera first, right? So one of the products, for example, we built ground up is called Google Lens. It's a way of reimagining search if you had to do it only through the camera. That is, can you search anything that you see, whether it's a business card, whether it's a book that you want to find out about, or a pair of shoes that you want the style of, etc. And again, it's still early stage, but already people are using it for identifying things. My most recent Twitter mention was someone who used it to identify that the mushroom in their garden was not poisonous. Thank goodness. Or the spider in their room was dangerous in this case. So it's this idea of can you rethink Google search camera first? Now, stepping back a little bit, when these words get thrown around a lot, augmented reality, kind of the immersive computing, etc. So to me, I think one of the most powerful things that's happening in computing as such is that for the longest time, we as humans adapted to computers. So if you think about this artificial way of like the keyboard and the mouse, etc., to touch screens, it's much more intuitive. And then fast forward, if you think about voice and conversation, it's a universal. The learning curve is so low, right? So whether a 90-year-old or a 5-year-old can use that. So to me, the next step there is with AR and sensing and vision, where if you can just point to things, or if you can just overlay information on what you see, that would be so much more powerful. And in fact, there's a stat, I read it on Twitter, so it must be true. It's 30% of our neurons in the cortex of our brain are devoted to vision. So we're highly visual animals. We kind of like process information much more visually. So imagine a task like placing furniture in a room, or figuring out which way to turn when you get out of a subway. Today, you have to you have those user needs, and then you translate it into your mind, and then use different awkward tools. But what if you could just overlay the answers right where your questions are, right? That's, I think, the attractive thing about something like augmented reality for me. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm super excited about this space.
Well, that's wonderful. And so kind of riffing on that, how do you see the next few months and the next few years in terms of AR and vision-based products?
I think, to me, there's 3 billion plus phones and users, and almost everybody, the most important tool being used is the camera. And one big shift that's happened, and it'll only accelerate in my opinion, is we started out using the camera and photos to capture some select memories, right? The occasional vacation picture or this perfect selfie. But then fast forward, we're already seeing with Google Photos, people use camera for all sorts. It's almost like a continuous recording of memories. It's it's that bill that you want to expense, or it's the wall art that you saw in some friend's place. So to me, one of the shifts that will happen is how do you get more out of what you're seeing, right? Whether it is in the moment where you're kind of pointing to things with the phone, or going forward and saying, hey, I'm really trying to redecorate my room. How can I use the camera? That's on the phone, because that's the at-scale devices that we all have. But I think, as you can imagine, there's future form factors that it'll only get better in terms of the tech here.
Wonderful. And so kind of what are some of the biggest challenges that you see in terms of building products in the space that you're building?
Oh, do you have 3 hours? There's the usual challenges, I would say, like abstracting from this specific area. I think there's the usual traps. So one is this tendency to think about scale versus solve. I always say we have to solve before scale. What I mean by that is it's more of a big company disease, but I think I see startups fall into that trap too, where you first think, oh yeah, here's a user problem, user need. I know, I'm going to come up with a solution. And then step 2, you don't think whether it deeply solves the user problem. You're like, how can I scale to millions or how can I overbuild the infrastructure? Now, there are a few cases where overbuilding helps. I was in Google search. It turns out the web grew in a hyperlinear way, so you ended up having to rebuild infrastructure every few years, so overbuilding helped. But that's a great and a rare problem to have. The usual mistake is overbuilding, not underbuilding. So I think that's one challenge that's less specific to my area, but I think this solving before scaling is really, really important. The other temptation, and our team included, is how do you, again, how do you look for meeting users where they are? That is, look for problems that they already have and accelerate the solutions. That's much easier than looking for, almost asking them to adopt completely different behaviors. So for example, right, one thing we see is that people are already taking pictures of these kinds of things. So can we help them there versus, oh, do this, right? Like after a while, you're like, your forearms are sore, it's a great exercise, but you rarely find people doing this for more than 30 seconds, 1 minute. Unless it turns out it's a winter recital of your kid or what have you. In that case, I've seen people go on for 4 hours right in front of your face. So I do think that this whole like fundamental user behavior changes are incredibly hard. So if you are thinking about problems to solve, you already have execution risk, you already have technology risk, you already have some market risk. So I would look for ways to de-risk on one of these dimensions, right? If there's an existing user problem, great. Then find a way to bring a gun to a knife fight, figuratively speaking, right? So how do you solve a 10x way this problem that's already existing?
So we have a very international crowd today, and it would be great to hear your perspective on what are the things that we're learning from other countries in terms of products or in terms of vision-based products.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Outside the US, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great question because, in many ways, and I'm saying something extremely like Department of Obvious, but I'll say it. I have the mic. Is this whole idea that in the US and the other developed markets, you've had the previous era of computing, right? You had the PC, you had the laptop, and then the phone. So a lot of the behaviors are learned from that. But to give you an example, we were talking about it right before. One of the user studies we did in Indonesia and in India, we showed this woman the software keyboard that shows up, right? The QWERTY keyboard. She's like, what the hell is this? Because she'd never seen a keyboard before. And why not, right? Because there's it's a mobile first and mobile only kind of world. So one of the things that I'm personally very excited about is, again, the role of camera. It's a universal language. It pretty much doesn't require anything other than pointing and seeing. So when you have that, what kinds of experiences can you build? And one of the things we recently worked on is an ability to just point to any text in your language or somebody else's language and just have that read aloud. And this is not something that's, in the US, yes, that's a nice to have if you go to a foreign city once in a while. But in many, many parts of the world, that can just be super empowering, right? That's just one example. The other one we were talking about is how the retail markets in China, the whole offline second kind of approach where camera and sensing has become a big, big layer of addition to any experience people have. Imagine Amazon Go-like experiences, but on steroids. What can we learn from that, and how can you bring elements of that back here?
Thank you. No, it's great, and we sometimes forget here in the Valley that there's a lot of things happening elsewhere in the world, but it's always very good inspiration, and it's great to see other countries, emerging with ideas. Moving on to maybe a more personal question, which it can be personal or professional. What is a new belief or idea that you have come across in the last few years that has most improved the quality of your life?
Again, do you have 5 hours? No. This is something that is top of mind just because I've been reading this book called Atomic Habits. I think I actually found some retweets from the author, and then I was like, oh, this makes sense. I should read this book. But the fundamental premise being, hey, don't try to if you're trying to do any personal hacks or productivity, don't try to make it about willpower. Make it about this incremental habits and the power of compound interest. Again, probably obvious to folks, but I was like, aha, that makes sense. Improve at the margin or the fringe. Especially for me, I'm a very all or nothing, 0 or 1 person. Yeah. So this has been a different way of thinking about it.
And one more personal question. How has a failure or an apparent failure in your life made you more prepared for whatever came next and for a future success?
Now, this is a 2-day question because lots of failures, first of all. That's the other kind of bad advice. So in the beginning, you think about very, in the computer science world, explore versus exploit, right? So a lot of folks, including myself in the beginning of my career, was like, okay, I'm going to be in the exploit mode. I'm going to basically make sure I find things that I'm really, really good at and just keep doing them. Turns out that's great for a short-term optimization. But then, both in computer science and in real life, you want to do the explore, exploit. What I mean by that is put yourself in situations where, of course, in certain phases of life, you want to be able to just ride on strengths that you have and create value. But other times, deliberately put yourself in areas where you are likely to fail. I mean, you obviously don't put yourself where you're clearly set up for failure. I've done that too, but don't do that. So one example I tell you is around 2012, I think, I had this sense that, oh my God, the phones are everywhere. This was before it was so obvious that the whole world would be blanketed with devices that are always on the go. And I said, oh, we should, and I worked on Google Search. So I said, we should personalize search. It should be far more helpful for you. Made a big deal of it, made a pitch, disaster, blew up in my face. Turns out because once you type in something into Google Search, it almost doesn't matter who you are. The personalization makes no difference. To me, that's been an interesting experience because the same knowledge, like I took and then said, well, maybe if it's in a different context where you're pushing information or if you're building an assistant that helps you, then of course what helps you is very different from mine. My flight schedule, my calendar, very different from yours. So I think one takeaway for me is a lot of times you want to kind of be clinical. Of course, after the initial hurt, go back and like very incisively look at what changed, what gave, right? Was it timing? Is it some thesis that was wrong? Yeah. Or is it, shitty coworkers? Like, what was it, right? Not that happens.
Thank you. And kind of to your point earlier about advice, we have a pretty varied crowd here, but we have students, we have young graduates, we have professionals. What is some advice that you would like to give to the audience? And you're welcome to give advice to, be it for you, the advice you would like to have received in college or later advice that you would like to share.
Oh, this is a fun one. I think one advice that certainly I got and I followed was be a builder. I think, right out of, after school, I ended up, working as an engineer in a company. It was an MIT spin-off called Akamai. Learned tons of stuff that I wouldn't have if I didn't go and build stuff. Right? Some of my friends, and they're really still friends, but they went into strategy consulting or banking or other kinds of things that are twice or thrice removed from the act of building. And I think anytime I also hear people wanting to be product managers, I say be product builders first. Otherwise, even if you did want to go, kind of be in a PM role versus an engineer role, you have no credibility, like if you haven't shipped and made contact with reality. So be a builder. Advice that I got and followed. Yep. Second advice that I got and didn't quite follow was, kind of this idea of sunk cost fallacy, meaning every few years, reevaluate where you are, almost re-interview for the job that you have, and to see if kind of still fits. Otherwise, you're kind of not really setting yourself and popping out one layer of the stack, so to speak. And then I guess the third one is more around, I think it's a variant of this explore, exploit, but don't be afraid to quit. Oh, that's the other thing. I dropped out of my PhD program with a lot of fear. I mean, I was a walking Asian cliche, right? I can joke here. I grew up in a family of doctors, mom, dad, brother, sister. I was literally the only non-doctor. And when I joined my PhD program, my mom was like, great, at least you'll be a fake doctor. And then I dropped out. So
I'm sure we have a lot of fake doctors in the room.
So I mean, don't be afraid to quit. That was a very angsty decision, but it was totally the right one for me. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Aparna. So we have a few minutes to open. We have 2 minutes to open for questions. So any questions in the room? I see one here, and in the back. And we need a mic. Great. The mic.
Project.
Okay. The mic is coming.
We'll repeat the question.
The mic is coming. So.
Aparna, good to see you up on stage. We actually shared some time together at Sarayu, if you remember me.
Yes.
So my question here is for the young people in the room that are on the borderline of getting into engineering, especially girls. Any advice you want to share around, how they can break out of stereotype thinking about STEM subjects in general?
I may give a kind of a bit of a head scratch or a response to this. So I grew up in India where I didn't know I was not supposed to be good at math. So I rocked. I was like a rock star math and computer science person. So my first interaction was in grad school when I was crushing this algorithms and data structures class, and this guy came up to me, and he's like, wow, like, how did you do it? I was like, do what? My point being, I think the defaults matter a lot. So one of the things that if you can assume that, instead of kind of framing it as, how can you think differently about like not wanting to be in STEM, why doesn't the default? And science is fun. It's like so much of fun, and logical thinking is fun, and it's it's lucrative too. Not to mention, it's a great career to have for everybody. And so, like, kind of thinking about it as well. Let that be the default, and see what comes out of it. I don't know if it's a actionable advice, but that's what comes to my mind.
Great question. All right, one more question, and that's it. So you get to choose the person. In the back, yeah, you raise your hand first.
Make it good.
Yep. So my question is around computer vision, specifically. Do you think disruption in this sector is going to come from big funded units like Google, or is it going to come through smaller, more lean units that are coming up?
I see an assumption there that the smaller is leaner. Sometimes you can be in the worst quadrant of the 2x2, where you're like smaller and slower. But I think, look, I mean, there's a clear, like, if you think about horizontal things like speech recognition and vision, data is a key lever here. But I think if you think about vertical plates, right? So if you're kind of trying to say industrial, sensors with or monitoring for kind of warehouses, etc., then you really need to look at the domain of the problem, and then solve everything, every step of it, which may be more of a startup's domain than any one particular micro vertical that Google or Amazon would go after. So I'd think about it that way.
Some great questions. Thank you very much for the questions. So thank you to Aparna for being here. Thank you for all the great advice. So thank you. We're very lucky to have her.